Hello everyone and welcome to Game Theory's Ask the Expert second session for this week. My name is Claudia Sestini and I'm the Global CMO at Game Theory. If you haven't heard of Game Theory previously, we're a global marketing effectiveness consultancy that helps marketers make better informed decisions via data and analytics. We are, of course, part of WPP, which gives us an amazing advantage in the marketing and media sphere. We also have the fortune of having lots of experience around wider business questions such as forecasting and scenario planning and staffing and helping people around pricing and planning. So today we're going to do a fireside chat with our experts, so taking into consideration some of our most asked questions from clients. Of course, being an Ask the Expert session, you'll be able to ask our experts via the chat functionality, either anonymously or using your name at any point in time, and we'll come to those questions throughout the session. So just for a little bit of context on today's session, we're getting lots of questions from marketers such as, do I advertise at all? How should that advertisement be planned out throughout the quarters? What should I be doing for Q3, Q4? What should the messaging be? And of course, the longer this goes on, the more complex these questions get and the more frequent these questions get. From a consumer perspective, we're seeing some interesting evolution. So if you look at data from online searches pointing towards phases of consumer needs and the states of those needs. So the first state that we saw was the survival state, which saw us panic by pantry items and disinfect and protect the home. The second phase that we were seeing from this online data searches was embracing quarantine, so insourcing items, pimping up the office, and a little bit of cabin fever. And then we're sort of at the make the most of it phase. So, we're seeing a lot of fitness trends and keeping fit at home, power nesting. So all of this will mean different things for different brands. Of course, there are brands that are experiencing incredibly high demand right now. There are brands that are being impacted by government regulations, store closures, travel bans. And of course, there are other brands that are ahead of everybody else, having almost been set up with e-commerce in mind before this pandemic started. So they're at an advantage. And so we believe that marketers can ask the right questions right now to help their businesses. So by being curious, by understanding the greater business needs and understanding the whole context of what's going on, to really help robustly inform their next steps and their actions. So with that in mind, I have two fantastic experts here with us today, Matt Chappell and John Webb, who will talk us through all the various permutations in several sectors. So we're going to look at retail, we're going to look at grocery, finance, and telco as well. And we're going to kick off with Matt Chappell, who's senior partner here at Game Theory and has really incredible experience across several sectors. But I'm going to hand over to Matt now to talk us through grocery. Matt, give us your sort of perspective of what's happening in grocery right now. What should marketers be really asking themselves, and how should they be making those decisions to help inform the business?
Thank you very much, Claudia. I think I'd like to start off by saying that I'm trying to make the most of the lockdown. I'm trying to get out and do my daily exercise, but I'm also finding out how many of my local breweries do deliveries, so kind of hands-free deliveries. So it's a bit of a combination of both. But if we move to the grocery sector, I think it's good for us to start on a real positive. But I also think it's worth saying that the grocery sector isn't one, isn't a sector that's having humongous growth, massive growth, and that's largely because of the constraints in place. So we've all seen, our local Sainsbury's or Aldi that has queues around the block because of the social distancing measures. There's a limit to how many people they can get in a store at any one time. And we also know that whilst there's been a move to online, there are also capacity constraints there, and largely that's driven by the social distancing measures as well. So, it's in a really good space, but I think we do have to put a hint of caution on that. And I think it's really interesting, you talk about the phases, we can talk about the phases within grocery as well. So you had kind of prior to coronavirus, the average household doing 4 or 5 shops a week. So whether that is a big shop in a big supercentre, all the way through to a top-up shop for tonight, or maybe even a little lunch run to the Tesco Express around the corner. That then rose to a staggering 9 to 10 shops during the week for every household in the period pre-lockdown as people were stockpiling. And we're now seeing that number dial right back down. And in fact, data from Google released yesterday or the day before, I think, shows that footfall in grocery retailers is down by 30% on the same period year on year when we look back this time versus this time last year. So it's all really interesting patterns. I think one of the main patterns we're seeing is in both online and bricks and mortar grocery retail is people probably getting into a position now where they've made their choice. So a lot of people are only doing one big shop a week, again, be that in store or online. And with that shop, they've made their choice and they are choosing to go to the same supermarket week after week. And so the question to marketers is, what are we trying to build? So are we trying to change people's transaction behavior? That's normally the key for supermarkets throughout normal times. But actually in coronavirus times, I think there are probably fewer opportunities to change transaction behavior. Where there are opportunities is to grow basket size, so to help people make the most of their shop when they are in the shop or when they are online. But also to increase loyalty. So to increase the fact that people during this period are doing the same shop week after week, but when things get better, how do we then make sure that people are staying with the same grocery retailers week on week or staying loyal to their online purchase journey? So we're seeing a lot of really interesting behavior from grocery retailers around things like helping supporting the NHS, helping support the least well-off customers, and really trying to embed that sense of being a consistent part of someone's life. I think there's also, we've all seen the news about frontline workers, definitely within the NHS, but also within grocery retail. We have to, they are definitely frontline workers who are putting themselves at risk on a daily basis to deal with the vast majority of our population. And I think there'll be a really interesting point in time when the colleagues and the employees in store will feel like they've worked really hard and put themselves at the coalface of the action against coronavirus. And it'll be interesting to see what that looks like when we start to get things better and things back to normal.
Fantastic, brilliant. Thank you so much, Matt. And I think it's really interesting you talk about loyalty because, obviously this period to some degree we'll see, a level of forced trials whereby potentially I'm going to try out a new supermarket chain, grocery chain, in order to find what I want, or perhaps out of, sheer boredom, I'm trying to mix things up a little bit, but that's fantastic. And what, Matt, one question to you in terms of kind of routes to market. If we're looking at Q3, Q4, I know it's really hard to say right now. We don't know what's going to happen, but what advice do you give grocery brands right now if they're sort of planning for what would normally be the run up to the holidays, sort of Christmas time, etc.?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. And I think, that Q4, that Christmas period is going to be key. It will either be a time of continued social distancing in which people might decide that they want, a big family at home out at Christmas, or it could be the time when we start getting back to normal. I mean, the advice for us is really do what you can right now to increase that loyalty, but also put yourself in a good place for when things do get back to normal. So one of the things we are seeing is continued advertising from grocery retailers, continued paid media as well. We think that's the right thing to be doing, because what it helps to show is that you're there during these times, you'll be there in the future, and having a presence now, having a presence in September, having a presence through November and December means that you'll be there and that you're planning in advance to be there, when things do get back to normal, so that then you've bought the media space, you've bought the advertising, and then it's a case of putting the right message into that media at the right time.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Matt. So next sector, having a look at retail specifically outside of the grocery area, and I would say also outside of Amazon, because it's sort of its own sort of beast, if you like. John Webb, who's managing partner at Game Theory, lots of experience in the retail sector, ex-economist, well, current economist as well, but would love to hear your thoughts around what's going on in the retail sector outside of grocery, outside of Amazon, but also what should marketers in that sector be thinking about where shops are closed, or certain types of shops are closed. In the US, of course, there are certain shops in different states that are still open. And if you're a retailer that hasn't really ramped up or invested in e-commerce prior to this pandemic heavily, sort of what kind of advice can you give marketers in the retail sector?
Thanks, Claudia. Hi, everybody. Yeah, it's a bit of a battle for retail at the moment. When we were looking at the questions and thinking about how we'd go and answer them, we almost described ourselves as the bull and the bear, and I'm very much in the bear camp, I suppose. Certainly for retail, it's over the last month, it has been a battle. Claudia, you described the different stages that consumers went through earlier on. I think we've almost got to see the same thing from a retail perspective as well, where initially a lot of companies were almost determining whether or not they would remain a viable business over the next quarter. And I think we're through that, and thankfully we've not had too many casualties so far. But definitely, you look at the economic numbers. I mean, the Purchasing Managers Index for manufacturing and services, they came out earlier on in a month. They won't be a surprise to anybody, I don't suppose. They've fallen off a cliff. We just had retail sales released either this morning, I think, or maybe yesterday morning for the UK. Retail sales down 5%. So that includes grocery as well as non-grocery, but grocery was reasonably well insulated. At the end of the day, people have got to buy food, but certainly non-grocery retail outside of Amazon is a challenge. So I guess what to do? Well, the first thing to do is to ensure that you do remain viable, and that's establishing cash flow. So most companies have done that, and the mechanism by which companies have done that, of course, varies by market. In the US, that cash flow has been protected by issuing corporate bonds, reasonable coupons. So JCPenney, AT&T, who we'll probably talk about later under Telco, they've all gone to market. They've all raised quite, significant levels of funds. AT&T, because they're more of a basic necessity, can get away with a coupon of 4%. Some of the retailers are offering 7 or 8%. But that funding is now in place, certainly in the US. And in the UK, we're seeing the loans come through from the banking sector, partially underwritten by the government, and that's a little bit slower to happen, but the funding is in place once a case can be made for that. So I think once you've gone through that stage and ensure viability, business viability, just almost stop and think that the business fundamentals haven't changed. If you're offering a great product before at a price that consumers liked and at a price that makes you money, those fundamentals are still there. The demand is still there for most retail sectors. Now, in the service sector, sports entertainment, gyms, restaurants, that's a different tale altogether. But in like white goods retailing, computer retailing, hardware, home improvements retailing, the demand is there if it can be reached. So the business fundamentals are still relatively strong for now. What has changed is the way that you hit and reach those potential customers. And I think that's where the challenge is. And that's where perhaps we need to consider the media mix in a little bit more detail and use the full suite of paid, owned and earned. But it's not a reason just because, you know, the stores are closed. That's not a reason to pivot away from TV or video in general. It's a great way of reaching a huge proportion of the population of your target audience. So, you know, each retailer, each situation is different, but don't pivot away necessarily too strongly from what you were doing before, really. The situation becomes slightly less clear as we move further on into the future. We don't know how long government income protection schemes will last, and we don't know how long any recession that crops up will last for. We don't know whether there'll be a V-shaped recovery or whether it will be, excuse me, slightly more prolonged. But I think we can take some learnings. We're seeing some evidence in Spain that some restrictions are being eased. And I know Germany, some of the restrictions will be eased from next week as well. So for retailers in other markets, watch what happens in these countries very, very closely, because Germany and Spain are obviously pretty similar to the UK. That will give us a good feel for how things are going to pan out here. And again, in the US, slightly different situation in the way that stores reacted, and obviously each state is different. But again, learn from where those markets where they're slightly ahead of the curve and opening a bit earlier.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much, John. And I guess a question for you on that, if when we sort of break down the categories in retail, so when we look at things like fashion versus, you know, for example, home improvement, I suppose, you know, with each one of those subcategories, we get different types of demand that are either being captured by the likes of Amazon or other retailers. Any views on these subcategories, sort of fashion and home improvement and the likes?
Fashion's tricky, isn't it? Because we've had a couple of fashion retailers go bust in the UK over the last few weeks. So it's obviously a difficult sector. And we also had the faintly comical BBC headline saying that British consumers are swapping fashion for alcohol, which is not necessarily the most helpful diagnosis of the problem, I guess. Look, some people will buy fashion online and they'll be happy to do that. And they will have been doing that over the last 2 to 3 years. Other people will see fashion as something that you need to go to store to try on, you know, sizes. I know myself, sizes vary from store to store. So I'm less likely to be fashionable, but equally I'm less likely to buy fashion accessories online. I'd prefer to go to store and see them myself. So I think it will be a slower recovery for fashion. Home improvement, again, in the UK, we've seen B&Q announce that they'll be opening their stores from next week. So they were already allowed to open because they're a hardware store that was defined as a key sector by the government. So different sectors, different levels of demand, and you just need to understand your own context very, very clearly. But I think that the thing to focus on, I mean, Matt touched on it earlier when we're talking about marketing. If you have a well-run and viable business with a solid cash flow, now is not the time to stop marketing. I'm not one of those who necessarily automatically believes in some kind of excess share of voice argument. And, you know, if you outspend your competitors, particularly in a recession, you'll grow X% more quickly than the others. I don't necessarily buy simple rules of thumb like that, but I certainly believe that you need to maintain a presence, to maintain awareness, to maintain consideration, and to maintain a link with your consumers. And by the way, when I say maintain a link with consumers, I don't mean change your creative to some of the frankly awful COVID-19 style creatives where we obsess on, you know, these are difficult times, these are challenging times, we're all in it together. I think I don't need to say anything more about that. If you need to see more, Mark Ritson has done a fantastic sketch on the whole topic, and I would urge you to look at his LinkedIn site for that. But if you had a good creative that was working pre-COVID and your business fundamentals are the same, then it will still work post-COVID. You might need to tweak it as the story evolves, but fundamentally, the overall creative shouldn't change dramatically.
Fantastic, brilliant. Thank you so much, John. And now over to CPG. Now, a really interesting category. I was talking earlier about the different states of need that we've been going through. And obviously, initially, that panic buy with pantry items was something we kind of all saw at the beginning, disinfecting, etc. But also sort of panic buying at supermarkets and, you know, buying whatever we can buy to sort of either ease boredom or, you know, just make sure that everybody has got everything they need. So Matt, tell us a little bit about CPG right now. What should marketers again be doing to you know, address, I suppose, not just the now, but actually kind of, you know, the medium and slightly longer term? Demand for many products is there, so that's not an issue, and I guess supply and distribution might be a challenge for some, and also, you know, we go back to the forced trials question. So over to you, Matt. Give us your view on CPG and questions that marketers should be asking right now to help inform those decisions.
Yeah, like you say, kind of fascinating area, and as John said, I'm lucky enough to be the bull, so I can be doing the kind of positive spin on things. CPG is hugely interesting, partly because we don't know yet whether this is the behavior that consumers are demonstrating is more like a return to safe havens as they look for some kind of comfort and security. So it could be a return to the products that they've always used and loved, and that could be anything from Coca-Cola to kind of disinfectant to disinfect their houses, but let me be clear on that. But then we also know that during recessions, people change from branded goods to own branded goods as some of that pricing impact starts hitting. And that's one of those things about forced trial, as people go through big life changes where they kind of become unemployed or have to take a job with less money. And we do see people moving into private label and away from the branded CPG giants that we all know and love. So I guess it's a bit of a wait and see, because we don't know which type of behavior is happening yet. We haven't seen the data. One thing we do know is that people are buying more online, be that through online grocery, as mentioned previously, or through direct consumer. So, you know, I mentioned at the very top, I'm going straight to some of my local breweries and they will deliver to me. But there are, you know, there's everything from direct consumer toiletries, direct consumer, you know, snacking foods as well, that will be gaining market share during these times. And I think that's a really interesting point about how those brands can make a distinct brand for themselves, how they can force trial and repeat and not just use pricing and promotional mechanics to do that, to keep a strong brand that people will want to continue buying in the future and want to continue buying when it's at full price and when things do change. So that's the question I'd be asking, is if we are a brand who's seeing big growth, who's seeing growth through selling online or selling direct consumer, are we maintaining our brand principles to ensure that we can charge full price rather than having to charge a promotional price? And I think when we look wider at marketing and maybe move into more like comms marketing, for me, there's a really interesting test and learn case happening right now. P&G have doubled down on advertising spend, and it seems to be straight out of their marketing playbook to invest more in times of recession. Coke have announced they're going to pretty much stop investing in some markets in above the line marketing. And so for two big CPG marketing powerhouses to be making such different decisions, you know, 3 months, 6 months down the line, it's going to be really interesting when we look at that data to see exactly what their fortunes have been through this. So yeah, not too many answers, more of a watch this space, but you can guarantee that we'll be looking at this data in a lot of detail and trying to understand what's going on.
I suppose here's a question for you, Matt, and taking into consideration, much of what you said sort of really makes solid, logical sense, needing to maintain brand awareness, going back to loyalty, which we talked about for retail earlier on. If I'm a marketer trying to justify that spend right now to my CFO, what is the best way of doing that? Because the CFO is sort of seeing high demand, potentially in some categories they're seeing high demand and a lack of distribution. So how do you justify sort of asking the business to invest in brand at this moment in time if you're a marketer trying to justify it to a CFO?
Yeah, so to carry my bullish theme, I would definitely use the opportunity and use that to, there is a real opportunity to be making some serious money from advertising at this time. So as John said, if most of your competition are reducing investment, you can be spending the same or spending a little bit more and guaranteeing yourself massive share of voice in this market right now. And I don't see who wouldn't want to do that, who wouldn't want to get such massive share of voice, to be gaining fame for their brand, to be really building their brand through this time period. I think it comes back to some of the other stuff as well. So if people are going through big life-changing moments, then people are changing the decisions they're making. So being there, being on air when people are making these decisions could be a really key factor to win more ground. And then also the fact that we know from studying this that around about 70% of all CPG advertising returns are made over the long term. They're not made getting people to buy your product here and now. They're made by getting people to buy your product maybe in the future, made by building memory structures, mental availability, making it easy to buy your brand when people are faced with a massive choice, and especially when they do come across those decisions. So really, what you're not doing is advertising for the now. What you're doing is advertising for the future, and advertising to cement your brand as a strong brand in this moment in time and for years and years to come. And like I said, I think that would be really interesting. I think, P&G, we know, are a set of brands that buy into this behavior and really believe in this long term and building up mental availability. It will be very interesting to see how they come out of this. Like I said, very interesting experiment from our side.
Fantastic. So there's a lot of watch this space and data to come in. So we go to another very interesting sector, one that game theory has a lot of experience in, and certainly John has a lot of experience in, is finance. I think very, very interesting kind of these questions around, what is happening in finance right now. There's economic impacts, sort of from a people perspective, from an economy perspective. What is the role of finance in consumers' lives, and I suppose consumer finance at this moment in time? And I've seen some great creative executions from a number of financial brands out there. So John, in terms of the finance market, where are we at? What sort of questions are marketers needing to ask? How are consumers behaving? A little bit of an insight onto that, and what next? What should marketers be really thinking about over the next 3 to 6 months? Over to you, John.
Thank you. I'm going to focus more on retail banking. In finance. I'll leave insurance to one side for now, because I guess motor insurance, household insurance, they're sort of almost standards that will always be required. Whether you're driving your car or not, you'll need some form of insurance for it. I'll also not focus too much on the payment card industry, because again, the demand for their products is fairly obvious, especially with more of a move towards online sales. You simply can't use cash in that environment. So if we look at retail banking, before we sort of talk about anything, I guess it's worth just reminding everybody that Fitch has downgraded a number of banking stocks recently, including Barclays and Co-op. in the UK and other banks wider afield. And the primary reason for that is vulnerability, increasing vulnerability of the banking sector to what is perceived as a growing risk of bad debt and defaults. And of course, if one bank goes down due to the interrelated nature of modern banking, will have a knock-on effect on other banks elsewhere. And some banks are really heavily exposed. We know that ING have got big exposure to oil, for example. I guess we all know what happened to oil futures recently, heading into negative territory for the May closure. And we've got others. So some of the French banks are heavily exposed to aviation. Again, aviation as a sector is, well, there's not a lot of activity there at the moment, and there probably won't be for some months to come. So again, bank by bank, we need to look at their overall books. I think from a retail banking sector, though, the biggest issue that's facing sort of like the banks on the high street that Joe Public will know is the spread. It's the net interest margin. So the spread between what a bank can charge on loans and mortgages and what it has to pay out in current accounts and savings accounts, more realistically. And that spread is narrow, potentially getting narrower, and doesn't show any sign of increasing over the next 3 to 4 months. So that places tremendous earnings pressure on banks. It's very, very hard to make money at a time when costs are inevitably going to increase. I guess in most countries, there are schemes that have been introduced by the government, some schemes that have been introduced by banks as well, that allow payment holidays on mortgages, allow people to defer payments on loans, perhaps reducing the criteria when people are applying for a loan to tide them over these times. All of those things are likely to increase costs. So if I go to my bank and say, look, I need a mortgage holiday for 2 to 3 months, then fine, the bank knows that they're going to get their money back and it will just be added on to the end of my mortgage term. But over those 3 months, they will lose a small fraction of income from that. And if you multiply that up by 200,000 or 300,000 customers, it becomes a significant amount of money. At the same time, there are also a lot of administrative costs. So most of the time with a mortgage, it's sold, all of the costs are incurred at the beginning. There's a basic level of administration that takes place over the life of the mortgage. But up until key points in the calendar where people think about remortgaging, and these tend to often be at fairly easily defined and predictable times, there's not a huge amount of admin that goes into the mortgage side. So anything like that is just going to increase costs and eat into those earnings. So again, tricky for finance. What they do have, though, is the potential to go from being perhaps the bad boys of the previous recession, the banking crisis of 2007 and 2008, into more, I'm not going to call them heroes, but certainly a force for good in this recession, as they do make loans to small businesses to keep them going, as they do allow mortgage deferrals and loan deferrals. So it can certainly help from an image perspective. And I don't want to make too big a deal of that, but I think image is important, and behavior now will have an impact on people's behavior and choices in the long term. Perhaps only in the margins, but the margins are important, and the margins can help determine whether your growth is 3% or 5%. So behavior now is pretty key. I think if you look at the specific issues that some of the banks might be facing, I mean, we've talked about the low spread or the small net interest margin. Operating costs are likely to go up in the short term. They may well come down in the long term as there's a systemic shift towards more online banking. The more and more that the people do transactions over the internet, the less and less banking staff will be needed. So not good for jobs, but good for costs. In the short term, stock price is an issue. We know that stock prices of banking stock or banking shares, they've fallen by about double the rest of the stock market. And again, that reflects people's attitudes to risk currently. They see the banking sector as a little bit of a risky game. But on the bright side, and it is very much a bright side, it's less of a balance sheet issue and more of an earnings issue. And I think the Economist put this quite nicely. There will definitely be earnings pressure as the net interest margin is low and as operating costs go up. But it's not a systemic, it's not an existential threat. It's not a balance sheet issue of the type we saw, over a decade ago with the toxic derivatives and bad debt in most of the banks. So I don't see a huge number of banking closures. There will inevitably be a small shakeout, I'm sure, but most banks, I think, will come out of it reasonably well. The issue will be in terms of marketing. It's more a holding pattern and a wait and see. I don't see any great need to go guns blazing for high growth, because I don't think that's going to happen in this environment anyway. Certainly if I had an existing relationship with a bank with a mortgage and a current account, now is not the time I want to introduce more risk into my life by looking to swap provider. I've got an established payment pattern. I don't want to jeopardize that by going elsewhere. But I think it is all about building awareness, maintaining awareness, building consideration. And again, seeing what's going to happen in the future in those countries that are ahead of the curve. And again, I'm looking at Spain, perhaps France, definitely Italy, as they come out of the crisis period.
Fantastic, brilliant.
Can I jump in? Sorry, Claudia. Because I think there's a really good and key point from John there around about the risk and the opportunity to be seen as heroes or to be seen as doing good through this. So what we know is that consumers are really looking to banks for advice, for support, for things like payment holidays, for small business loans, maybe personal loans as well. But what we also know is that there's a real risk that banks could be seen as not supporting people through this. So as a good example, when Rishi Sunak announced that there would be small business loans, people immediately got on the phone to their banks, and that that caused a lot of banks to be at capacity, to the point where a lot of them on their websites now have capacity notifications saying, please don't call us unless it's something absolutely urgent. We know a lot of banks are going out with adverts right now talking about looking after the customer, protecting the customer, and so therefore, if you can back that up with good customer service, if you can be shown to be protecting them, there is a real opportunity. So I think when it comes to what banks should be marketing, that's a real space where you could emerge as with a much bigger market share, with a kind of more heroic customer view of yourself as a brand out of the back end of this, which I think is really exciting. But there is also lots of downside risk to not being able to support those customers.
It's definitely one area where retail was in a slightly more advantageous position, having already built up web search capability for Black Friday and other big events that the banks don't have a Black Friday as yet. I'm sure there's one only just around the corner. So yeah, definitely. There's always, I mean, one person's crisis is another person's massive opportunity. Agility and a willingness to pivot quickly will be the keys that determine the winners.
Yeah. I think the other thing, and again, a bit like CPG, where will people be going into the known safe brands? So will people be wanting to maybe consolidate their money with like an HSBC or a Barclays or an NatWest, or will people be wanting brands that are more digitally native? The point is, if you can't go to a branch, if you can't pick up the phone and talk to someone, and you're doing things online, then why wouldn't you go to someone who has an app that's been set up by a digitally native fintech bank? And it'd be really interesting to see whether consumers which way they'll flip, whether they'll go to these fintech newer banks, or whether they'll maybe go into the safe havens that existing banks provide.
And I think there's a couple of interesting points being made here. I think the point on creative messaging, sort of for brand promise, the point of consumer experience. I think expectations set by some of the fintechs and sort of newer brands, or brands that really invested in that online experience and digital experience. So it'd be quite interesting to see now when people kind of have that expectation of brands, that expectation is now kicking in. So the connect between brand promise and then actual brand delivery, and how those two kind of meet each other and how that pans out. Fantastic, brilliant. So we then move on to our last sector for this session, which is telco, so telecommunications. And obviously everybody is on their phone a lot at the moment, or certainly on a screen. And Matt, you and I had a really interesting conversation about this earlier on, didn't we? About some households really sort of running out of bandwidth because you have people working from home. If you're in a family, depending on age of kids, you've either got kids homeschooling on Google Classes, or perhaps older kids, they might be on some sort of gaming apps, and then Netflix, etc. So there's that side of things in terms of consumer demand certainly being there. Matt, what are your thoughts on what's happening in telco at the moment? What should marketers be considering, I suppose, both from a planning perspective, but also from a messaging perspective? And where do you think things are going to head in this next sort of 3 to 6 months?
Yeah, and like you said, was a really interesting conversation earlier. I think what we're quickly starting to appreciate is how poor the internet and broadband network is in Europe, UK, and the US compared to China, Korea, Japan, where they just wouldn't be having these bandwidth issues of maybe two parents trying to work from home, a teenager on Fortnite, and someone else on TikTok. But so I think what we're seeing actually within telco is different uses of, so for people who sell bundles and for families who use bundles, different uses of those bundles. So people using technically much less 3G, 4G data, although whether people are having to bolster home bandwidth by doing so, we'll see. But people relying much more on their home broadband and on their home TV packages. So I think we're previously looking at a world where people were much more reliant on their mobile network when they were out of home, and now having to rely on their home network. And so I think if I was in a situation where I was having to, as a consumer, having to bolster my home bandwidth with extra 4G with using mobile devices, then I'd be pretty hacked off straight away with my broadband provider, and I'd be looking at possibilities to change. So I think there is the big risk and big opportunity here for some of those telco broadband, home broadband providers, where customers could be really reevaluating their telco packages right now, could be really looking to change, could be looking to up their broadband bandwidth. But at the same time, when there's lots of people changing and lots of people in the market, that offers a big opportunity for people to be gaining that change, for people to be gaining that market share. So it could be a big crunch point. And I guess the big question you'd have to ask yourself as a marketer within telco is, do we want to support our existing customers with maybe offers to stay on, or upgrading paying to upgrade their packages, or offering them maybe free content, free Netflix packages, we used to be things like BT Sport and Sky Sports, or do we go after that acquisition market, and are we aggressive in that acquisition market? You're going to be unlikely to do both, so there's probably a big decision you need to be making about whether you go after acquisition or you go after retention. And then I think the other message is that link between brand building and price. Again, if you decide to be quite aggressive in that acquisition market, it can be quite, there can be a big case to be made for offering lots of price-led packages. First 6 months are a half price, or maybe extra data for the first 6 months, those kind of things. But we also know that, back to some of the other conversations we've been having, you need to maintain a strong brand through that, so that people aren't just buying you on price, because otherwise you're just creating a perfect economy where people only buy who the cheapest is, and you can actually use your brand to be able to differentiate and provide a differential within that market. So I think a good and an interesting case was BT, who said, unlike John's example earlier, that they didn't want to do the generic "we're here for you" COVID type messaging, wanted to maintain true to their purpose of helping get Britain more tech savvy, more data savvy, and use this time to be able to advertise and grow that purpose. And if they can grow that purpose, and if people are linking it back towards who BT are as a brand, then that could put them in a good stead for the long term. But yeah, I think those two, it's almost that decision tree of retention versus acquisition, and then within acquisition, price and aggressive promotion versus brand building, that will be the fundamental questions that telco brands will have to be asking themselves.
Fantastic, brilliant. Thank you so much, Matt. And so we're almost out of time now. We've answered many of the questions that we've been getting pre the session today. Obviously, any other questions, please let us know directly, which you can do emailing us directly, and we can sort of come back to you on those following the session. We do have another session on May the 6th, so if you're interested in joining us, again, let us know. We'll be looking at how to plan with certainty these uncertain times. So, you know, how can you make more robust decisions with data available now, as opposed to sort of, you know, data available sort of 3 to 6 months ago, which pretty much won't really help you going forward over the next sort of 6 months, and how you can really sort of start to plan next steps. So that session will be on May the 6th. Please get in touch if you want to join. But Matt and John, thank you very much for joining us again this week. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking to you, and we hope that everybody stays safe and well, and tune in again on the May the 6th. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.